The first thing we need to do for this project is to actually go ahead and create a new document. In this case, we're going to create a new HTML5 Canvas document because we want this to be viewable on the web on any device that supports Canvas, which is basically anything that supports HTML5, which is basically any web browser. So let's go ahead and sort of have a look at the differences between what we've seen before using an ActionScript document type and what we have here with an HTML5 Canvas document. You'll notice right off that we have the 3D rotation and translation tools grayed out, so we're not actually able to use those. Additionally, if we go into our text here and we look at the text tool, we have static text, dynamic, and input text, and we can only choose dynamic text for Canvas. There are other sort of limitations that you can find in terms of blend modes and filters and things like that, but we'll see those as we go along. The next thing we'll want to do is actually create a new layer. So we'll go down here to the new layer button inside the timeline. And now that we have two layers, we want to rename these layers. So the first one here, I'll rename to BG, and the second I'll rename to Frame. So our BG layer is going to hold the background content, and our frame layer will hold the frame content for our animated greeting. Let's go ahead now and actually save this. So we'll choose File, Save. In terms of our stage, there's not a whole lot that we're going to do. I'll actually go ahead here and pop in some hex values. So we want the stage to be this sort of orange color. We'll also use a rectangle to overlay this, but for now, this orange color is just fine. Now notice when we actually go ahead and apply a color to this stage, that this does not affect any of the keyframes in our layers. So we still have two completely empty keyframes here. 550 in width by 400 in height is just fine, as is 24 frames per second. So our stage is completely set up at this point. And we do have the frame and background layers within our timeline. Let's unlock the background layer, because here we'll actually go ahead and draw out our background. To do this, I'm going to simply use the rectangle tool. And normally I prefer the rectangle tool to have object drawing mode enabled. This makes it so I don't accidentally join and destructively overlap different shapes. What I'll do here is a little bit of setup. So you can see here that object drawing mode is on. If it's off, you now have this convenient method of turning it on directly from the properties panel. Let's choose this little white swatch with a red line through it for our stroke. That indicates that we're not going to use a stroke, so no stroke applied to this particular shape. And for a fill, we're going to use that same color, so this color right here. Note that we could also go ahead and use our eyedropper to sample that color directly from the stage if we wanted to. Now, these values for stroke, style, width, and so forth don't matter since I have stroke disabled right here. So the only other thing we need to do is go ahead and click and drag to form our shape. You'll notice that even though the stage doesn't look any different, that our background layer does have content within the keyframe now. So whereas this frame layer right here still is an empty keyframe, you can tell that this is indicated by the unfilled circle. Now in our background layer, we actually do have a filled circle, and it shows up as having content. Let's go ahead and choose our selection tool, and we can select this shape here. We see that it's a drawing object since we created this in object drawing mode, and we can adjust the position and size. So let's align this to an X of 0 and a Y of 0, and for the width we want to have this at 550 and the height at 400. Alright, so that is perfect. That's exactly how we want this background to appear. So right now we have this very solid background to our animated greeting. What we want to do is make this really unique. So what we're going to use is a new tool inside of Flash Professional called the Paintbrush tool. If I select this, we can determine a stroke color. Make sure to enable object drawing mode because when we actually draw out these strokes, we're going to do so on this same background layer, and we don't want them colliding destructively with one another. We can also increase the stroke a bit. So maybe I'll take this up to something like 20. And for our stroke color, we'll choose to sample the present background color and then go ahead and adjust this with this little color wheel here. And I'm going to make it a few steps darker, something perhaps like this. So now that that's done, we can go ahead and open up our brush library. So this is accessible right here on Style. If we click on Brush Library, it appears for us in our Brush Library panel. And using Brush Library, we can choose from a whole lot of different vector art brushes that we can use to draw out these kind of natural brush strokes across our content area. So let's go ahead and choose one of these. I'm going to go to Artistic, Charcoal, and let's go ahead and look for one called Chalk Scribble. So here it is. It's obviously very dynamic looking. So I'll double click on that, and you can see that it populates inside of our stroke style right here. At this point, I can close our brush library and then have a look. So if I draw out a stroke like this, we can see how that looks. And you can also, of course, do a wavy line like that. Let's go ahead and increase the stroke a bit and draw out some more. You may want to actually back up to something like 50% to do this, because then you can start the stroke well off of the actual stage inside the pasteboard and simply draw up like this. I'll make the stroke a little bit darker just to add some variation to what I'm doing here. Increase the stroke size some more and do a final run across just like that. If we go back up to 100%, we can see how this stroke appears. It's very dynamic, very fluid, and it really gives some character to our background. At this point, let's go ahead and use a selection tool to actually select some of these strokes and modify them a bit. So as you can see here, I can move these strokes around just like any normal stroke, and I can even bend them with the selection tool just as I would a normal stroke type. So we can make some adjustments to the strokes we've already laid down, just to balance things out a bit. And that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and lock this layer down and unlock the frame layer, because we'll create the frame for our animated greeting next. Now we're going to go ahead and actually build out a frame for our animated greeting. And we're going to do this with the rectangle tool once again. So going over to the tools panel, let's choose the rectangle tool. And fill and stroke, we want to make some adjustments to. For my stroke, I'm going to pop in this particular value here, which is a nice green color. And for my fill, I actually don't want a fill. So I'm going to choose this option right here, which renders no fill whatsoever. For my style, I'm just going to use right now a simple solid here. And I'll just pull the stroke down to 2 perhaps. And with our frame layer selected, on frame 1, I am going to click and drag across the stage to form our frame. Right now, the frame is very, very small because it's only 2 pixels. Let's go ahead and use the selection tool to select our drawing object that we just created. We can see it's positioned at the 0, 0 top left corner here of our stage, and it is 550 by 400, which is the exact same shape as our stage. We'll increase this a bit, so pop up that stroke somewhat so that it actually does overlay our stage and would be visible upon publication. In this case, what we'll do is instead of choosing just this straight stroke here, we'll choose a variable width stroke profile. So clicking on the drop down here, there are a number of presets we can use. So let's choose perhaps this one right here, width profile number 2. And you can see how this varies now. So it makes it more natural, more organic. We can actually make adjustments to this if we choose the width tool here. With the width tool selected, I can hover over any existing width control points to make adjustments to them, as you see. So I don't want this to be too crazy. I can also add adjustment points here and relocate adjustment points along each particular stroke. So for instance, I don't particularly like how this little corner up here looks like it doesn't have any stroke whatsoever, so I simply make my stroke, my variable width, a bit fatter, and I'm able to join those pieces there. And that's exactly what I want to have happen. I can also select this object, and we can see that this particular width profile that I just created is different from the rest of these. I can add this to my collection with this little plus button here. So add to profiles, and I'll just call this greeting frame and hit OK. Now this is part of my variable width profile library, and I can choose it and apply it to anything else that I desire. Additionally, we can actually add art brushes to this as well. So you can mix a variable width profile and an art brush on the same stroke, which is pretty neat. Let's open up our brush library, and we'll choose a brush to use. I like this chalk round right here for a frame, so I'll double click on that and close our brush library. You can see that immediately it is applied to my stroke, and it still retains its variable width profile personality. Maybe I'll up this a little bit, something like 40, and I can even continue to make adjustments using the width tool if I desire. Now there's this weird piece right here that I want to do away with, so I'm going to choose the subselection tool. And from here, I can actually shift this point up a little bit, or use my arrow keys. So with that shifted over, it makes my job with the width tool a bit easier, because I'm able to actually now make that width overlap those pieces that I would like it to. Now that our frame is complete, we can lock our frame layer and move on. Now before we move on to draw out additional elements for our animated greeting, I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup here and organization. When you're working within layers, even though they're all named appropriately, sometimes it makes sense to group them together in a folder. To create a folder, you can just click on this little new folder button right here, and we get a folder. And just like layers, they're all named with sequential numbers with the term folder. So I'm going to double click on there and rename this to background. If you want, you can even expand that area there by clicking and dragging on this portion of the timeline so that you can see the entire label of your layers or folders. This particular folder doesn't actually have anything in it, as you can see when I open and close it here. However, we do want to include both our frame and background layer within there. So we'll select those, click and drag, and notice how we can drag these above the folder like this, or we can actually drag them below the folder, such as that, or we can drag them within the folder. So notice how that little white dot and the black line appear indented. If I release now, they are now both indented and within the folder. So if I collapse the folder, we no longer see those layers. The idea for this greeting is that we're going to have a flower pot, and there's going to be some animation of a flower growing, emerge from the flower pot. So let's go ahead and create our flower pot. What we'll do first is actually create a new layer, and we'll name this flower. Okay, with that layer selected, We're then going to go to the rectangle tool, and let's choose a brown color. We can always tweak this later, but that'll be the color of our flower pot. And for our stroke, we actually don't want any stroke associated with this, so I'm going to remove the stroke. I'll make sure to have object drawing mode on. And as far as all of these stroke attributes, they really don't matter very much since I don't have a stroke. So somewhere around here, I'm going to click and drag to make like a small square. And we can see that width and height is about 104. I want to make this about 120 on width and height, so I'm going to lock the width and the height with this little chain here, and I'll type in 120. And now that gets updated on both the width and the height because this is locked. I'll unlock it here, and just kind of move this guy over a little bit. Additionally, I'm going to create a sort of filled in oval for the top of our flower pot. So to do that, I'll use the oval tool. And again, no stroke. I'll make this a bit darker. So something like that. And from here, I'm going to simply click and drag to pull out an oval like this. That will be the top of our flower pot. Notice this is on the exact same layer as our flower. And actually, if I go ahead and move these over one another, we can kind of see what I'm trying to do in terms of making the flower pot look more cylindrical. Now we'll go ahead and actually shape out our flower pot so it doesn't look so much like the square that it is right now. So the first thing I'll do is just move this, this background piece out of the way. And notice with the selection tool chosen here, when I hover over any of the corners of our shape, that the cursor changes to an arrow with a little arc near it. That means that I can click and drag to kind of push and pull the shape. So if I click and drag here, we can see how that affects the shape. I want to just pull this down a little bit so it looks like the top of a flower pot. And I'm going to do the same exact thing down here. So that'll be the bottom of the flower pot. So now things look a lot more curved and cylindrical. I'm going to make some adjustments here to our oval. So to do that, I'll actually use the free transform tool. Maybe I'll actually zoom in quite a bit here. There we go. So now we can see this really well. With the free transform tool on the side here, if I just click and drag, it's going to transform our oval from the transform point. However, if I hold down the Alt key, it will shift it in only one specific direction. Additionally, I can make further adjustments to our basic shape right here. Let's move this up a little bit with the arrow keys. And again, just tweak this. Oops. So I need to go back to my selection tool here. And there we are. That's what I'm looking for. All right. So with this done, I can shift that back down here until it's perfectly lined up with our cylinder. If I scroll down a bit, until I can see the bottom here, I want to use my sub-selection tool to go ahead and tweak some of these points down here. So selecting one of those bottom corners, I'm going to push that in 3, and I'll do the same thing here. Notice when one of these points is not selected, it's white, and when it is selected, it turns this pink color. So 1, 2, 3. And I'll go back to the sub-selection tool and simply move that up a little tiny bit just so it looks like that. All right, now I will go back out to 100% and recenter my stage. Okay, at this point we have what looks like a pretty nice little flower pot. It no longer looks like a big square, it actually has some depth and dimension to it. Now we're going to even further refine the look of our flower pot by using a linear gradient. So Right now our flower pot is a flat brown color. If I want to use a gradient on here, all I need to do is open up my swatches here. So here's my color and here's swatches. So inside of color, I want to choose not a solid color, but rather a linear gradient. So a linear gradient, as you can see expressed here, goes from one color and gradiates to another color. These colors are expressed through these little key points here. And you can add as many as you want just by clicking along the spectrum from black to white here. Of course, we don't want to use black to white. We want to use dark brown to light brown. So let's go ahead and make some adjustments here. I'm going to choose a nice dark brown color right here. And then I'll select this key and once again tweak this so that it's a lighter brown color. And you'll notice that it previews over here in real time. Okay, that looks pretty good. So now if I want to actually reuse this, I can add it to my swatches panel just by clicking this button right here. So add to swatches. Going over to my swatches, if I scroll down, we can see there is my swatch. Now there's something else that's pretty nice in Flash Professional that you can do with any sort of swatches that you create, whether they're linear gradients or solids or whatever, and that is to create a tagged swatch. So if I click this button right here in my swatches panel, I get this additional dialog where I'm able to actually create a tag color definition. So I can give it a name, and then again review and tweak any of the different aspects of this swatch I want and hit OK. Okay, so right now we have our flower pot assets here, and there are basically two assets. We have this object here, which is sort of the inner back of the pot, and then we have the kind of front area. What we'll do is select both of these items, and we'll use these to create a new graphic symbol. So there are a couple of ways we can do that. We can always select one just by clicking on it with the selection tool, and then hold down Shift and click the other, and now we have both selected. We can also go ahead and just draw a selection rectangle across both objects to select them both. Additionally, we can click on the keyframe that those objects reside in, and everything within that keyframe is going to be selected. Now that we have these objects selected, we'll go to Modify, Convert to Symbol. Here we can give the symbol a name and declare its type. So we'll call this flower. And this is the name of the symbol as it will appear in the library. And we don't want a movie clip symbol in this case. We're going to choose a graphic symbol. Now you may be wondering what the difference is between a movie clip, button, and graphic symbol. Well, a movie clip symbol has its own independent timeline. And by independent, I mean independent of the main timeline. So even if you had a movie clip existing on just one frame, it would continue looping its own unique timeline. However, a graphic symbol actually has its timeline tied directly to the main timeline, and that's why we're choosing it in this case. We also have the ability to create a button symbol, and a button symbol is something we'll see in another video, but it's basically a specialized type of symbol that only has 4 specific states, simulating a button. So choosing graphic symbol, let's hit OK. And there is our graphic symbol instance on the stage here. Notice if I actually select this and look in my properties panel, it shows me that it is a graphic instance, and it's an instance of flower. We can always swap this out with other symbols in our library. We don't have any other symbols right now, but if we did, we could easily swap it out right there. Let's look at the library itself, and we can see that here is our graphic symbol, and within the library, we get a little preview here as well. Okay, so now that we have everything set up on our main timeline, such as layers and folders and so forth, we're going to want to go into our symbol itself and make some adjustments in order to prepare the symbol for further modifications. So I'm going to just double click on our flower symbol so I can edit it just as it is right here. And notice that we have layer 1 right here, and layer 1 contains both of those two shapes that we created. We're going to want to put each of these shapes on a new layer. So to do that, I'm going to make sure that both objects are selected, and then right-click on both of them and choose Distribute to Layers. So what this does is it goes ahead and it removes it from the original layer, which I can now delete, and creates two additional layers. So layer 2 is holding that top piece. Let's go ahead and call this pot back, because it's sort of the back of our flower pot, and we'll lock that. Layer 3 here is actually the pot itself. So we can see if we go to properties, it's also a drawing object, and here it is. It's hard to see against background here, but it's selected. So let's just call this pot, and we'll lock that as well. So now we have our pot and pot back layers. And the reason we do this is because if we have something growing out of here, then we want to have that animation happen between both of these layers. Since we have to animate objects inside of Flash Professional on their own layer, we'll need to create a layer that goes between here, and we'll need to keep the pot back and pot each on their own separate layers. So now we have our two layers, our pot back layer and our pot layer. Let's create an additional layer to hold our stock. So we'll create a new layer there and name it stock. With that layer created and that empty frame selected, we can now draw out our green stock for the flower. It's going to sort of emerge from the pot, so we can just right now just overlay it on here and make adjustments afterwards. For this, I'm going to choose the regular brush tool, not the paintbrush tool, because I want to create a fill for our shape, where the paintbrush tool creates a stroke similar to the pencil tool. So choosing the brush tool here and going into properties to make some adjustments. I'll keep object drawing mode on. I generally most always keep this on unless I have a good reason to turn it off. And for the fill color, I'm going to pop in a hex value here of this nice kind of bright green color. Down here under brush shape, here I can choose a particular shape. I think that this circle shape is just fine. And I can also choose a size. I'm going to bump that up all the way to the top here. And now I'm going to move over to my pot and hold down the Shift key so I can draw a nice straight brush stroke and simply draw up like this. With that created, I can choose with my selection tool and just have a look and see how it kind of came out. We can see because it is an object drawing mode object, or a drawing object as displayed in the properties panel here, that we get this nice object-based outline around the entire thing. We can also see under position and size, the X and Y position of course, also the width and the height, which looks pretty good. I'm going to make it a little bit taller, so maybe 220. There we go. And I want to make sure too that this is actually aligned to the center of my other objects. So let's disable these locks and draw a selection rectangle around all of these objects. Going into the Align panel, I can then, instead of aligning to stage, I want to align all the objects together. So I'll untick Align to Stage and Align Horizontal Center. You can see that really doesn't make any difference. It's just to make sure that I really am centering all these different objects. Now that this is done, I can make some adjustments in terms of my layer stacking. So I'm going to want to have the stock between the pot back and the pot. So it looks as if it's emerging from the pot like this. So what I have here is pot back at the very back end, and then my stock emerging, and then up front is my actual pot face, or pot as it's seen here. Okay, now things are going to get pretty interesting because we're going to use the Bones tool to create an armature. Over in the Tools panel here, we can see here is the Bone tool. And once I select that, I can then go ahead and draw out bones within shapes, or even construct armatures out of multiple movie clip instances so that they behave and flow naturally as I create different poses. To do this, I'm simply going to actually turn off the visibility of our pot and our pot back so I can focus on this shape here. Our intention is to create a number of bone segments in here so that we'll be able to animate this stalk sort of emerging from the pot. Let's zoom in a bit here. And to create bones on a shape, we just click and drag. So we'll click down here and drag up a bit. Let's make this initial bone larger since it'll be inside of the pot and it doesn't have to do much to emerge. And then we'll just simply draw out a number of different bones just like this. Let's put one more at the end. Great. So everything we see here are different bone segments. If I choose the selection tool here, you can see that I can actually select all the different bone segments individually. And in the Properties panel, I can see that they're an IK bone. And if you ever see IK, it stands for Inverse Kinematics. This is the sort of physical animation that's applied to an armature. Here we're able to specify different things about joint rotation, translation for X and Y, and things like strength and damping. So most of this you really don't need to worry about too much. However, some concepts that you should know about is that this bone right here, and you can see that this is sort of like a master bone. This is where everything originates, and then these bones all spring from that. So with that in mind, looking down in our timeline here, we can see that our layer has actually changed somewhat. So this is the previous stock layer that we had, and it is now empty because everything's been taken from there and put into this armature layer. So let's delete the stock layer. And for our armature layer, we'll just rename that to stock. So we can see here that this is an armature layer because it's got this little person running, is what it looks like here. So that tells us, hey, this is an armature layer. Additionally, we can tell it's an armature layer by the color of our frame span here. Let's actually bump the frame span up to 65 for all of these layers. So click and drag across frame 65 here across all layers, and then go up top and choose Insert Timeline Frame. And this extends all the layers out to frame 65. You'll also notice, apart from this green color, that the initial keyframe looks like a little diamond here, sort of like what you would get with a motion tween. This is a pose right here, and the initial pose for this is straight up and down. However, if we use our selection tool, we can actually grab onto any portion of this armature, and as you see, we can make it organically move about. As I move parts of our stock, other parts organically follow along according to this bone structure that we've created. Let's undo that so it's nice and straight once again, and we'll re-enable the visibility for our pot and go back out to 100% and center the stage. Let's talk a little bit more about managing poses. So as mentioned, this little keyframe here is known as a pose. We can actually copy and paste poses across our armature layer to create animation. So actually, if I right click on here, you can see that we have remove armature, but we don't have the normal create motion tween, create shape tween, create classic tween that we normally have up here because armature layers are special. They automatically animate between poses. So let's click on this pose right here, and then we'll right click, and notice right here we can choose to copy pose. Moving down to 65, because this is actually the last pose that we want to have happen with the flower fully extended, we can right-click on here and choose Paste Pose. So notice that the little diamond is represented here as well. And we now have our pose that is equal on frame 1 and frame 65. At frame 1, we can go ahead and actually adjust this. So using the selection tool, we can click and modify this pose here. And if we preview this in the timeline, we can see that everything animates automatically from one pose to the next. So this is one of the powerful things about armature layers, that it has a unique way of animating content. And you can go ahead and just keep adjusting these different poses to create different structural, natural movements based on the bones that you've created as part of that armature structure. Now that we have an understanding of how armatures and poses work, let's put that to use and complete the animation of our flower stalk. The first thing we might want to do is go all the way down here to frame 1 and just bundle the flower stalk down into the pot. And for this, I'm going to turn on onion skinning here so that we can see the outline of the pot, and we can also see the backing of the pot as well. So here I can actually just sort of grab each of these and sort of pull them down into the pot until they are just kind of nicely bundled up in there. So there we go. And right now you can see it sort of emerges like that, which we obviously don't want because it's breaking out of the side of the pot here. So let's go ahead and go to perhaps frame 20. And on frame 20, we can adjust our pose. So here we might want to have part of this thing actually starting to emerge here. There we are. And this can take time because you're going to be sort of moving things around and making adjustments and previewing them and so forth. And it takes a lot of just kind of tweaking to get things to look exactly right. Let's move over to frame 35 here, and we'll adjust the pose yet again. Nice. And you'll notice that there's some artifacts going on here. These can be dealt with in different ways. I'm simply going to make some adjustments to my keyframes and my poses as we go along, but you can actually use the bind tool right here to make adjustments to any of these things. You can see if I have the bind tool selected and I zoom in a bit, that we have control with the bind tool over all of these different little segments here. So this is one way that you can make adjustments and compensate for these little artifacts that sometimes happen when you're using an armature with a shape tween. However, for this example, it's okay. We can deal with that sort of stuff, and we don't want to spend a ton of time actually doing that. So let's recenter the stage and continue on with our poses. And actually, that looks pretty good. I'm going to, of course, make an adjustment right here because we don't want that to poke out of our flower pot. That's the main consideration with this particular armature animation here. There we go. All right, so let's go ahead and we will turn off outlines here. And let's just play it back directly in our Flash Professional authoring environment using the timeline controls. All right, that looks pretty good. So now we have our armature layer, and it's animating our content with a number of different poses until we get all the way to a fully extended stalk here. However, I I'm actually going to create a little bit of deviance here because I think the stalk looks a little too straight. So there we go. All right, that is pretty good. Of course, I could go on tweaking this for hours until it's just right, but I think for this project that is going to work just fine. Now that we have our flower stalk, we're going to go ahead and draw out and completely design a flower head. So let's lock down all of these layers here. And what we'll do is create a new layer and name it flower. This is where the head of our flower will exist. Here we need to decide exactly where the flower itself is going to appear upon our stalk. So let's go to something like frame 45. And with that frame selected, we'll choose Insert Timeline Blank Keyframe. Now, if we choose blank keyframe, it's going to insert, of course, an empty keyframe here that we can then fill with content. But note that since we already have the previous keyframe being empty, even choosing keyframe in this case is going to create a blank keyframe for us. Because this keyframe is empty, this keyframe is empty. In that case, choosing keyframe or blank keyframe is going to have the exact same effect. Now that I have that created, let's actually start with our sort of the center of our flower. I'm going to choose to use the oval tool here. So going over to our tools panel, I'll click there. And I'm going to actually use both stroke and fill, but I'm going to apply the same color to each, and you'll see why in a moment. So this orange color be applied to each stroke and fill. And what we'll do is draw out an oval of around 40 pixels. So if we think about the flower like that, if I select that, I can see it's 41, which is perfect for our case. We don't have to be exact here. And you'll notice that the keyframe down in our layers in our timeline is actually a filled keyframe now because we have content in there. So the next thing I want to do is actually make adjustments to our stroke. To do that, I'm going to use a vector art brush from our brush library. So let's open up the brush library. And here I'm going to choose artistic and charcoal. And I want to use charcoal tapered. And that you can find down here. So there's charcoal tapered. I'm going to double click on that, and it's automatically applied to our style and our properties for this particular drawing object. Now you can't really see it right now because the stroke is only a value of 1 here. So let's push this up a bit, and you can see as we do how that looks. It looks very floral. So I just want that to poke out a little bit, just like that. So it's got some rough edges there. And that looks pretty good. The next thing we want to do is create a number of different petals that are going to be sort of displayed around the flower head to make the entire flower. So to do that, I'm also once again going to use the oval tool, but this time I don't want any stroke, so I'll disable that. And for our fill, I'm going to use this color right here. It's kind of a nice pastel yellow color. I'll draw out an oval here, and notice I'm not drawing a circle in this case. I'm just drawing a normal oval. So let's draw that out and then select it and see that it's about 65 in width and about 25 is what we want for height. So there we go. If you were drawing it, of course, in portrait, these particular values would be inversed. So you'd have a width of 25 and a height of 65. But this is all pretty arbitrary, right? So now that that is created, let's go ahead and duplicate this a number of times. I'm thinking that we'll probably need about 7 copies of this, and that's going to give us 8 petals in total. So to copy things very easily, just hold down the Alt key with the selection tool selected and just pull off new copies. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So now I have 8 drawing objects that are our petals. To actually arrange these, what we'll do is first take some of these items that already are in place, such as these here, and just kind of place them roughly here and there. All of these others we're going to have to use the free transform tool to rotate before we place them. So let's choose that now, free transform tool. And here we're able to move the transform point if we desire. And then once we rotate, it will rotate around that transform point. In this case, we don't necessarily have to, because we can just rotate around the center since they're not really placed yet. However, it's good to know that you can do that. This really makes a difference if you are actually animating things, because then you would definitely want to have the animation rotate around a specific point. So you could choose your transform point before you start animating things. That's very important. However, these petals aren't really going to animate, so it doesn't matter that much. Now, when I'm rotating these, I'm actually holding the Shift key down so that they will be rotated to a nice 90-degree angle. You can see here without the Shift key, I can rotate it however I want. However, with the Shift key held down, it is constrained to those angles. Okay, so you'll notice here that it's not exactly perfect in terms of a circular petalscape. So I'm just going to select these and use my arrow keys to make adjustments to their position. And that looks pretty good. Next, I'm actually going to hold down Shift and use the selection tool to select all 8 of these and then group them. To group them, we can choose Modify, Group. Now that these petals are one complete group, let's right-click upon that group and choose to arrange Send to Back. You'll notice that immediately sends it behind the center of our flower. So at this point, our flower head is nicely constructed and ready to be animated along with our stalk. Okay, the last thing we need to do to complete our flower animation is to convert the head of our flower here into a movie clip symbol, and then to motion tween it along with the stalk animation. So to do that, we just need to select both of these objects, both the petal group and the center of our flower, and then go to Modify, Convert to Symbol. Here we'll choose a movie clip symbol, and we want the registration point to be at the center, and I'll give it a name of Bud and hit OK. We now have a movie clip symbol, as we can see in the Properties panel here, name of Bud. If we look in the library, sure enough, here is our Bud movie clip symbol, along with our flower symbol. So we have 2 symbols right now. The first thing I'll do is just right-click on this frame span here and choose Create Motion Tween so that we can tween this object. Down at the far end, so on 65, I'm going to go ahead and use the Free Transform tool with the Shift key selected to determine exactly how I want this flower to look. So let's actually turn our outlines on so that I can further position this at the head of our stalk, just like that. And now I can turn that back off. So pretty good. I may actually want to rotate this a bit as well, just so it's not straight up and down. Okay, this is how it will appear finally after it's animated in. Now going back to frame 45 where the animation begins, I'm going to make this super tiny. So let's take it all the way down to something like that. And then we'll just shift that into place and then preview. All right, we can see it appear here We may even want to do some additional animation. So let's select it and then zoom in to like 400% and use the free transform tool once again to just rotate it a little bit. So now as it comes in, it sort of rotates a bit, twirls into place, just like that. All right, that's pretty nice. We could also go ahead and see how we might be able to actually give this motion tween just a little tiny tug here to make it a little more organic, a little less linear. Very nice. There's all sorts of things you can do inside of Flash Professional to make a motion tween seem more natural, and this is just one of them. Let's lock down this layer now because our flower animation is complete. Now our flower animation is complete. However, we still only have one frame here, and if we actually would publish this right now, the flower would never animate because it is, if we click on it, we can see a graphic symbol. And a graphic symbol is bound to the timeline that it exists on. So frame 1 is always going to correspond to frame 1 in the internal timeline. If we go into the flower symbol, we can see that we actually go out to frame 65 here. So going back up to our main timeline, let's go ahead and select frame 65 across all of these layers and choose Insert, Timeline, Frame to extend everything out to that very end. You'll notice all of a sudden our flower pops up, and that's because we're at frame 65 of the graphic symbol timeline as well. Let's create a new layer for our message. So we'll create a new layer right above the flower layer and simply call it message. Here we're going to actually want the message to show up on frame 65. So pulling the playhead all the way over to 65, let's go ahead and insert a keyframe. So insert, timeline, keyframe, or blank keyframe, either one will work. And here we can now draw out our text block. So I'm going to choose the text tool here. And if you notice, because we are targeting HTML5 canvas, we cannot choose static text, which is what we would ideally choose in a situation like this. Static text is going to render as outlines for us when we publish, so the person viewing the animated greeting isn't going to need the same font that we use to author it. Dynamic text is going to require someone to actually have the font installed on their system. However, there is a way around this, which we'll demonstrate in the remainder of this project. So dynamic text is what we're going to choose because that is our only choice. For the font family, we can choose whatever we like. I'm going to choose this font called Jokerman. And let's go ahead and draw out our text here. I'll simply say a flower for you. And this is a 68-point font here. You'll notice there's a couple things going on here. If we look inside of paragraph, we can see that because this is dynamic text, we don't have the ability to choose a wrapping style for this. So what we'll do instead is insert specific breaks. So I'll just do Shift Enter here. And now that I've done that, we can see that it breaks out just fine. Another thing we can do, of course, is decrease the size of our text so it fits in there a little bit better. But additionally, I want to change the color of my text. This green just isn't very nice against the rest of these colors here. So I will go ahead and use my eyedropper to see how different swatches that already exist here actually look when applied to this text. I'm going to sample using the eyedropper here from my petals. And that's not perfect. However, we can actually make that a bit nicer with text effects, which we'll see shortly. All right, let's make this text stand out a little better against the background with some text effects. Going into my properties panel with this text selected, I'm just going to collapse a whole bunch of this stuff because I want to focus on filters right here. This is how you add effects to both text and movie clip symbol instances. So clicking this button allows us to add a filter. I'm going to add a drop shadow, but you can also choose blur, glow, or adjust color when targeting canvas. If we were using an ActionScript-based target, we could also choose from bevel, gradient glow, and gradient bevel. However, it's a little more constrained when we're targeting HTML5 canvas. So let's choose drop shadow, and here we have a number of different things that just happened. We can see that our text definitely stands out a bit better now. It has that drop shadow applied to it. And we also have the drop shadow filter here, which we can toggle on and off using this little eyeball to see the difference. And we can adjust the values. So let's adjust the value of our blur X and Y to 6 pixels, just to make it a little more widespread. And for strength, we'll keep that at 100, and color, we'll keep that at black. Now notice, even though we are able to use the drop shadow filter in HTML5 Canvas, we actually can't adjust a whole bunch of these other things, which we would normally be able to inside of an ActionScript target. It's just something to be aware of. So this stands out quite a bit better than it did beforehand. So as mentioned before, when using dynamic text, we have a couple choices we need to make in HTML5 Canvas. We can actually choose to render this text as shapes. And if we do that, the person viewing it isn't going to need the font that we use here. However, shapes cannot have things like drop shadow filters applied to them, so our drop shadow is not going to appear if we choose to render the text as outlines when we publish. So how do we get around this? Well, since we can actually apply drop shadow filters to movie clip symbols, that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to choose this drop shadow, and in my filters area here, I have options. And here we can copy selected filters. So I'm going to copy the filter, and I'm going to then delete the filter. Additionally, with this message selected, I'm going to modify and convert to symbol. Here we'll convert this to a movie clip symbol and name it message. Hitting OK. Now in my filters area of the properties panel, I can again click on options and paste filters, and the exact same filter properties are pasted in here for us. So that's a great way to be able to use both filters and creating text outlines for HTML5 Canvas. All right, at this point we have our background elements here drawn out. We have our animated flower, and we also have a greeting that pops up at the end after the animation. So let's go ahead and test this. If we go Control, Test, our animation is exported and run in Canvas. However, you'll notice that everything just keeps looping over and over, and we never really see this greeting here in a way that we can actually read the thing. So what we need to do is actually stop the animation from continuing past that last frame. To do that, we go to our timeline, and whenever we create code in the timeline, we want to give it a special name and keep it on its own layer. Let's choose to create a new layer, and we'll name it Actions, and lock it down. So now if we create any code and bind it to this layer, it'll appear on frame 1. However, we actually don't want that to happen. We want it to happen on frame 65 because what we're doing is stopping our animation here. So we'll put a little command on frame 65. But to do that, we have to insert a new keyframe. So let's go Insert, Timeline, Keyframe. Now, if we put any code on frame 65, that's exactly where it's going to execute. Let's have a look at our Actions panel. You can get there by going Window, Actions. All right, here's our Actions panel, and we can see that these are actions for frame 65. So that's the exact frame we want. So to actually do anything in here, we could just start typing things in. you'll notice that as I type, that we get all of these different suggestions here. However, there's actually an easier way to know exactly what to type when doing simple things on the timeline, like stopping the timeline. So let's have a look at the Code Snippets panel. We can access that from right here. And in our Code Snippets panel, it's divided into code for ActionScript, HTML5 Canvas, or WebGL document types. Since we're using HTML5 Canvas, let's open that up. And right away we can see timeline navigation, stop at this frame. So we have two options. We can copy it to clipboard, or we can add it to the current frame. Since we're already at frame 65 in our Actions panel, let's choose Add to Current Frame. All right, so you notice a couple things happen here. Let's make this a bit bigger and this smaller. What we see on the side here is this column that shows us where specific code is placed along our timeline, because you can have code in many various places. We're only dealing with our code in one spot, so let's just collapse that and have a look at the code that we have. You'll notice the code right here. It says this.stop. This is going to refer to whatever object we're currently on. Here it's the main timeline, so it refers to the main timeline, the stage. It's saying stop right here. Stop refers to the playhead, and it's telling the main timeline that we want the playhead to stop on frame 65. And we have this comment up here, stop at this frame, and it explains the timeline will stop or pause at the frame where you insert this code. It can also be used to stop pause the timeline of movie clips. Let's actually remove that comment because we just simply don't need it. All we need is this.stop. You'll notice also that on that particular frame, we now have this little weird A symbol. This indicates that there is code on this particular frame. With our stop command in place, let's go ahead and test once more. So Control, test. All right, and sure enough, the timeline does in fact stop at the end of the animation. So we've accomplished exactly what we set out to do with a tiny little bit of JavaScript code that's controlling our playhead. Let's have a look at publishing options for our HTML5 Canvas document. If Publish is not opened up here, you can just twirl it down and access Publish settings that way. You can also access them by going to File, Publish Settings. And here are our publish settings for the HTML5 Canvas target. So a number of things to note. Publish JavaScript/HTML is checked here. You can also publish JPEGs, OAM packages for use inside of things like InDesign and Dreamweaver and Muse, or SVG images. So let's have a look though at JavaScript/HTML. Here we can specify a publish destination, which is going to be the file path and the name of this JavaScript file that gets created when we publish. Now, in this particular instance for this project, I wanted to introduce the concept of being able to write JavaScript directly in the Actions panel. And the way we did that is that we stopped the timeline from looping with a little bit of code. However, if you untick this loop timeline option, that will basically do the same thing for you. Aside from this JavaScript file, Flash Professional will also create an HTML document to run the JavaScript in. If you want, you can customize that after it's first created, and then if you untick Overwrite HTML, it won't overwrite your HTML customizations every time. There's options for exporting assets to specific folders, so your images, sounds, and the actual Create.js libraries that run the animation. We don't have any images or sounds in this case, but if we did have images, we could also choose to render a big sprite sheet of all our images. In that case, it only makes one call to pull in the images, so it's not making a lot of traffic. If we're using additional JavaScript libraries, we can also choose to include specific namespaces when referencing different objects in here. Notice we also have an advanced section here, which we can collapse or not. I'm choosing to use CDN hosted libraries. this is going to go ahead and pull all of the Create.js libraries actually down from a content delivery network. So in this case, we don't have to publish the libraries ourselves. We only have to publish the JavaScript file and some sort of HTML file to go with it. We can choose also to include hidden layers from our timeline, to compact shapes, to render multi-frame bounds, which we might need if we're doing advanced things with frames inside of JavaScript. And we can also, as mentioned, convert our text to outlines. So when we choose this, it's going to render all of our text not as dynamic text, but as actual static shapes within our animation. This is good because it means that somebody viewing the animation isn't going to need the same exact font that we used when authoring the file. When we're finished, we can always just hit publish, and it'll publish our document for us, and hit OK. Now you'll notice here that it gives us a number of different warnings. It tells us that frame numbers in Easel.js start at 0 instead of 1. This is, for example, if you're actually jumping to different portions of the timeline and you're used to working in ActionScript, because in ActionScript, frames start at 1 and not 0. It mentions here that shadow and glow filters are very expensive, and that motion tweens are published as frame-by-frame animations, and to use classic tweens where possible. Depending upon your project, the warnings that come out in the output panel when targeting HTML5 canvas can vary. If we have a look at the files that have been generated, here is our authoring file, and it's generated both a sample HTML file for us, and here is our actual project file, this greeting.js. So this JavaScript works in conjunction with HTML canvas, which is defined in here, and also with the Create.js libraries that are being pulled down from CDN. So right now we're targeting HTML5 canvas, but if you like, you can also target another HTML5 native published target known as WebGL. To do this, we're going to convert our current project to a WebGL project. So to do that, go up to Commands and choose Convert to Other Document Formats. This brings up a little document type converter, and we can choose from any document types that we have available to us. So I can convert it to WebGL, I can convert it to Flash ActionScript, or even some sort of custom format like Snap SVG Animator. I just happen to have this one installed, but there are a number of additional custom formats that you can gather from addons.adobe.com. I'm going to choose WebGL, and I'm just going to save it in the same location. By default, it's going to append _WebGL to the file name. Let's hit OK. And there we go. It's converted our document from HTML5 canvas to WebGL, and it's given us a number of additional warnings. So you can see how that drop shadow filter is not supported in WebGL, and it's been removed. Frame scripts have been commented out, and text cannot be imported in WebGL. So, going to the timeline, if we look, the text doesn't show up, what we'll have to do is actually go back to our original document, and what we can do is simply break this all apart or render it as a bitmap. So let's right-click on here with the text selected and choose Convert to Bitmap. So you'll notice that Flash Professional goes ahead and creates a bitmap for us of this. We can copy and then jump back over to our WebGL document, select the empty movie clip symbol that used to contain our text, delete that, and then with that particular frame selected, right-click and choose to paste in place. And then we have our text back. We don't have to worry about outlines and so forth because this is just bitmap text at this point. There was also the comment about frame scripts. So let's go in to our Actions panel and have a look at that. Window, Actions. This opens up our Actions panel, and we can see that this.stop has indeed been commented out. However, if we open up our code snippets from here, and we have a look inside of WebGL, you can see that WebGL also has timeline navigation. It also has stop at this frame. So let's add it to the current frame. And look at that. This.stop, in this case, is actually the exact same syntax that we just used inside of HTML5 canvas. So even though Flash Professional proactively said, oh, this isn't going to work inside of WebGL, it actually would have in this case. Most of the time, though, it won't. Most of the time, you'll have to change things. The reason for this is because even though we're still using JavaScript in WebGL, it isn't JavaScript that's tapping into the Create.js libraries. We don't use Create.js in WebGL. We actually use an internal Adobe authored WebGL rendering engine. So the code differs significantly depending upon what you're trying to do. For publish settings for WebGL, you can access them the exact same way. And you'll notice you have a lot less of them here. So WebGL will generate a JSON file. It will overwrite or not the current HTML that is rendered. And we can choose to include hidden layers and loop the timeline. When we're ready, we hit publish. And when that's finished, OK to go back. So alongside of our HTML5 canvas objects here, we have a couple of things that are particular to WebGL. One is our WebGL authoring file. We also have our HTML file here, and then we have a number of additional folders. So here is the library that runs our WebGL. And then under assets, we have a JSON document. We have any actions as a JavaScript file. And we have a texture atlas and the texture atlas JSON. So these are basically sprite sheets. All of this works together to actually have the WebGL content run in the browser. And of course, to preview this, you just go to Control, Test, and there is our completed animation. And it appears just as it did with Canvas. However, this time it's actually rendering it with GPU accelerated WebGL.